Professor Ellner, if I may begin with you, what's actually going on in Venezuela? What are these protests about?
Okay, firstly, the protests are in reaction to a problem of shortages, a very acute problem over the last several months. On the other hand, it should be pointed out that the protests are concentrated mainly in upper middle, and upper class areas of the major cities of Venezuela. Very little is going on in the barrios, in the poor areas. It's mainly concentrated in middle class and upper middle class areas, where the mayors of those areas tend to be members of the opposition.
That's very different from how, in the late 60s, early 70s, America's ghettos basically were on fire. What accounts for the middle and upper middle class revolting as opposed to the poor people?
Well, I would say two factors. One is, on the one hand, there is a problem of shortages. There are long lines to purchase basic commodities, and there is scarcity of a lot of products that middle-class people purchase. So that's part of the situation. The other part is that the opposition has been trying to unseat the Chavista government, firstly with Chavez and now more recently with Maduro, has not recognized, and practically never has, recognized the legitimacy of the government. And as a matter of fact, Maduro, who was elected president in April of last year, the opposition immediately claimed that he was an illegitimate president, that there was fraud. But really, their accusation of fraud was really based on accusations of what's known in Spanish as ventajismo. In other words, that the government spent a lot of money on its propaganda, but very little in the way of concrete, well-documented accusations of fraud. More recently, in December of last year, municipal elections were held. The Chavistas won those elections by an 11 percentage point margin, and the opposition did not claim fraud in those elections.
Yeah. Gregory, how has the corporatized mainstream media been covering the events in Venezuela?
Well, by and large, the mainstream media, particularly the media in the United States, but also in Europe, has been portraying the protest as though it's an issue of the government cracking down on peaceful protesters. And then you can see this over and over again. This is also echoed by the Obama administration. Vice President Joseph Biden just recently came out with a comment again, urging the government to restrain itself and to stop the violence against the protesters and things like that. But the fact is, as I think Steve Ellner can verify, is that the protests have been quite violent, actually. And if you list, the number, they say that there's something like 20 people have been killed. Most of those deaths actually have been the fault of the opposition. If one goes through them one by one, only a handful, something like 3 or 4, are attributable to state security forces. And even in several of those cases, the ones responsible have been indicted and are under arrest. So, of course, those are the things that are never mentioned in the mainstream media, that the government is making sure, going after state security forces that have been violent, and that the majority of the protests have actually been quite violent, and that the state security forces are reacting to that violence. As a matter of fact, they've even had to close a number of bus lines and subway stations precisely because the protesters, actually I should call them vandals, have basically destroyed the facilities in many cases.
Professor Ellner, why would the media portray these protests in this way, and for that matter, not cover more peaceful protests? Why this kind of coverage?
Well, firstly, there are 2 types of protests that are occurring. One is, as Greg mentioned, the violent protests, vandalism, with the targets being a state property. The Banco de Venezuela, which is a state bank, the food distribution chain, Pedaval, their trucks have been attacked. As Greg mentioned, metro buses have been attacked. The state television channel has been under attack by the protesters. So that's one part of it. The other part, and this is something that the opposition parties are emphasizing, that there are peaceful demonstrations of students. But these demonstrations, although they're peaceful, are disruptive. Typically, they will take over main avenues and highways and block the traffic, allow traffic to go through just on one lane, on 3-lane avenues. And immediately the traffic backs up for miles. So that's what's happening on the ground. And the media does refer to peaceful demonstrations, but they don't mention that all the demonstrations are disruptive. The other point that the media doesn't mention, as I said before, is that the demonstrations are taking place in middle class and upper middle class areas of different cities throughout the country.
I heard a voice coming. Gregory, what's your take on why the Venezuelan government is always painted as an authoritarian government with a dictator-like leader?
Well, I think there's a couple different factors involved. One is that it makes for a much more interesting narrative, and that is easier for people to interpret and understand. You know, the protesters rising up against a dictatorial government. That's a kind of an old kind of
cliche.
Cliche, exactly. I mean, it's one that is also being portrayed in the case of the Ukraine and Syria, wherever. And it's you know, just to use the same schema to interpret every situation, when every situation is quite different and unique in many ways. That's one factor. And the other factor, I think, is just that U.S. media tend to be very, very much in tune with U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. foreign policy is oriented towards painting the government of Venezuela as being the bad guy in the region, and therefore any protest against this bad guy must be the good guys. And that's it's an old, you know, strategy or old line that the U.S. media have taken for a long time to basically echo the foreign policy preferences of the U.S. government.